controversy over in Israel. So Benjamin Netanyahu has come under fire from the left for pursuing a plan to democratize the Supreme Court of Israel. And the media are so hypocritical about this sort of stuff. They really are. This, particularly in the United States. The media in the United States keep saying that Benjamin Netanyahu is some sort of fascist, that the newly elected Knesset majority in Israel is some sort of fascist organization for seeking to, I kid you not, change the procedures for the Supreme Court so the Supreme Court nominees in Israel are nominated by the Knesset or nominated by the prime minister and then confirmed by the Knesset, which sounds very much like the United States system. And also, they want to make sure that because Israel has no constitution, the Supreme Court can't just make up a constitution and declare itself dictator. And somehow this makes Israel more fascist. It's ridiculous. To understand that basically everybody on the left wing in the media are looking for an excuse to rip on Benjamin Netanyahu and the current Israeli administration, you have to understand exactly how Israel's judiciary works. The answer is it's essentially a self-selected dictatorship. The way that Israel selects its judiciary is absurd. Thanks to the supposed constitutional revolution of 1992, the Israeli Supreme Court can rule out of bounds legal acts of Knesset, leaving an unelected, unaccountable set of oligarchs in charge of national security issues. There's no constitution in Israel. So in the United States, the Supreme Court says, we are speaking in the name of the Constitution. We're striking down an unconstitutional piece of legislation. Israel's Supreme Court says the same thing, but there's no constitution in Israel. So they're basically just saying, whatever we don't like, we can strike down. Not just that. The Knesset never gave that power to the Supreme Court, and the way the Supreme Court is selected in Israel is absurd. Again, in the United States, the way it works is the president picks somebody for the Supreme Court. That person goes through an advice and consent process from the Senate and then is confirmed. In Israel, the way Supreme Court judges are selected, they are appointed by the president of Israel, who again is not the prime minister, from a list submitted by three current Supreme Court judges. So they pick their own successors. Imagine if instead of Donald Trump being able to nominate Amy Coney Barrett and Justice Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court of the United States, imagine if instead of Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, Amy Coney, instead imagine that it had basically been Justices Kennedy, Breyer, and Souter declaring who should be the next justices on the Supreme Court. It'd be ridiculous. There are a couple of other Knesset members who are involved. 2 representatives of the Israel Bar Association are involved. Can you imagine the American Bar Association nominating people for the Supreme Court of the United States? Approval requires 7 of the 9 members of the committee, which means the left-wing Supreme Court has complete veto power of whoever gets appointed. Now, what's even weirder is that in Israel, the way it works in the United States is the Attorney General in the United States is chosen by the President of the United States. He's part of the executive branch. Then he is confirmed by the Senate. Right? He's a constitutional officer. In Israel, the Attorney General is completely separate from the Prime Minister's office. The Attorney General is selected by unelected bureaucrats, including a retired judge from the Supreme Court, a former Justice Minister or Attorney General, so basically Justice Breyer and Eric Holder, and then a Knesset member chosen by the Constitutional Affairs Committee of the Knesset, and an attorney chosen by the Israel Bar Association. That Attorney General has a 6-year term and veto power over Knesset legislation. It's totally unconstitutional. I mean, it's utterly anti-democratic. So Bibi Netanyahu comes into power with the new coalition. He says, this is ridiculous. We cannot have unelected bureaucrats in Israel declaring essentially all legislation or vetoing legislation. These people aren't even nominated by the elected branches or subject to the removal of the elected branches of government. And so what happened in Israel is that the former Supreme Court head in Israel, Aharon Barak, came out and started demagoguing. He started saying, this is an overthrow of democracy. Fascism is at work. Okay, just a quick definition on fascism. When an unelected body of oligarchs decides all law in a place, that is significantly closer to fascism than when an elected body, the Knesset, which apparently rotates every 5 minutes over there, actually gets to make the law in the state of Israel. It's absurd on its face. Now, this has sort of come to a head because Bibi Netanyahu was told by the Supreme Court of Israel that he had to dismiss a senior minister recently convicted of tax fraud. So here's what's so weird about this particular story. So there's a guy named Aryeh Deri. Aryeh Deri is the head of a party in Israel that is allied with Netanyahu. Deri had been convicted in the past of a few different crimes. And apparently, when he was basically pleading out the crimes, he said that he had no intention of running for high office again. Then he ran for high office again. So the Supreme Court went back and said, we will not allow you to hold the high office because you said you wouldn't hold the high office. What? Huh? In the United States, if you get barred for a criminal offense, The court just bars you for a criminal offense from doing the thing. They don't say like, well, based on your you did promise. You promised. Have you ever heard of such a thing in the United States? Somebody pleads out a crime like, well, judge, I really promise I won't be bad again. He's like, well, sounds good to me. That isn't what? Huh? In any case, Netanyahu actually, he abided by the Supreme Court decision. He actually told Derry he couldn't sit in the government, and he's still considered a fascist. Okay, what does all of this suggest? It suggests that basically you have a lot of people who are pissed off that Netanyahu won the last election cycle in Israel, and so they're looking for an excuse to yell at Netanyahu and call him a fascist, despite the fact that he's been elected with a majority in Israel. End of story. All the people who are currently protesting are protesting nonsense. They've yet to come up with a durable issue to go after Netanyahu on, and so they're claiming he's a fascist for attempting to restructure the judiciary in a more democratic way, not an anti-democratic way, a much more democratic way. And then they're claiming simultaneously that when he abides by the will of the Supreme Court in particular situations, he's still a fascist. All of this is silliness, but again, it goes to an underlying tendency on the left, and it is cropping up over and over and over from country to country. Whenever the left does not do well in an election, they just declare that fascism is at the door. When Donald Trump wins in 2016, the fascists have arrived. If Ron DeSantis were to win in 2024, the fascists would be back in the United States. When Viktor Orban wins in Hungary, it's fascism. When Netanyahu wins in Israel, it's fascism. When Lula wins in Brazil, not fascism. When rioters create mass violence in Peru, not a threat of fascism.